Vladimir Putin would have already taken over all of Ukraine if it weren't for me. Such a statement was made today by the American President Donald Trump, but after that, he unleashed criticism toward NATO. But he still confirmed that the United States will never leave the North Atlantic Alliance and, on the contrary, will only strengthen it, in defiance of all the dictators who would like to see NATO weakened or even collapse. And today, it was the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin who got the most criticism from Trump. Trump said he won't let Putin take all of Ukraine and is prepared to boost weapons production for allies. In addition, Trump is already openly seizing Russian Shadow Fleet tankers and warns that the Kremlin would be better off not interfering. In addition, Trump directly called on the new president of Venezuela to completely sever all ties with Russia and China within a short period of time and urged them to follow the example of everyone else in the region. Moreover, the largest oil company in India also stated that it has completely stopped purchasing Russian oil. And now it is officially reported that Russia's oil export revenues have fallen to their lowest level since the start of the full-scale war against Ukraine. In general, Trump has decided to put pressure specifically on oil. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this episode, and leave any comment you wish. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. So, I'll start with a rather sharp statement by Donald Trump to NATO, which on one hand seems to praise the alliance, on the other hand criticizes it, and on the third hand says that Americans will never abandon NATO. Here, I'll quote Trump in full for all those big NATO fans. Remember, they were at the 2% NATO mark, 2% of gross domestic product, and most of them weren't paying their dues until I came along. Well, actually, the United States was foolishly paying for all of them. With all due respect, I raised them to 5% of gross domestic product, and they started paying immediately. Everyone around said it was impossible to do, but it is possible because, after all, they're all my friends. Without my help, Russia would have already taken all of Ukraine. Let me also remind you that I personally ended 8 wars, and Norway, a NATO member, foolishly decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize. But that's not important. What matters is that I saved millions of lives. Without the United States, Russia and China wouldn't fear NATO at all. I doubt that NATO would be with us when we really needed them. Everyone is fortunate I rebuilt our military in my first term and still am now. Well, that's certainly not true. I would add that the only time in history when Article 5 of the NATO Charter was invoked was after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, and NATO responded then. I'll continue with Trump's quote, "We will always stand with NATO, even if they don't stand with us." The only nation that China and Russia fear and respect is the United States of America, rebuilt by Trump. Let's make America great again. And now some experts claim that Trump got offended by the Europeans who don't want to give him Greenland, and that's why he made such a post. But in this situation, it's not just the Europeans who should be concerned. Not even so much the Europeans, but rather the Russians. Why? The thing is, Trump has already openly stated that the United States needs Greenland for national security reasons. Since Russian and Chinese warships freely sail in the waters of Greenland and Europe does nothing about it. So, I don't rule out that as a compromise, Europe and the United States might agree not on transferring Greenland. That all of NATO together will have to drive the Russians and Chinese away from this island. That could be the compromise. And Trump decided, by the way, to show how this can be done and, importantly, proved that there's no need to be afraid of the Russians at all. The fact is that today the European Command of the United States Armed Forces reported that the tanker Bella 1, which left Venezuela, changed its name to Mariner and switched its flag to Russian, was detained in the North Sea. And here it's worth remembering that Moscow had previously officially asked the Americans to stop pursuing this tanker. A few days ago, the Russians quickly re-registered the vessel under Russian jurisdiction and claimed that it is no longer a Shadow Fleet vessel and therefore supposedly not subject to United States sanctions. The Kremlin threatened to view the tanker's seizure as aggression and responded with talk of torpedoes, etc. At first glance, it seemed that the Americans backed down because the vessel continued on its way to Russia. Later, when it became clear that the United States Coast Guard was still pursuing the tanker, Russia even sent a submarine and 2 warships into the Atlantic to escort it, basically to intimidate the Americans and show we're prepared to attack if needed. But as it turned out, all those Russian warships were near the tanker at the time when the Americans were seizing it. However, they didn't take any action. The Russians just watched as the Americans seized their tanker. According to the Financial Times, United States Air Force Pilatus U-28 Draco aircraft and a Royal Air Force Poseidon MRI, 1 aircraft which can be used for anti-submarine warfare and surveillance, were sent to the site of the operation. In short, the Russians were told, don't make any sudden moves, so they observed and left. That's exactly what they did. By the way, it was precisely by targeting oil that Trump decided to strangle Putin. Do you remember how the Russians themselves said that they were very afraid of the Nicolas Maduro scenario? Sanctions were imposed on oil, followed by a blockade, tanker seizures, and finally the dictator's capture. So Trump has already imposed sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil and has also started seizing tankers. Well, the logical chain is forming. And today, by the way, Zelensky also added fuel to the fire, saying that the Americans should also capture, for example, if not Putin, then Ramzan Kadyrov, to show Putin that he'd better go to negotiations and make concessions on Ukraine. But for now, Trump continues to put pressure specifically with oil. The administration of Donald Trump demanded that the acting president of Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez, expel Russia, China, Iran, and Cuba from the country, as well as break all economic ties with these countries. Sources in the White House reported that Venezuela must agree to exclusive cooperation with the United States in oil production and give preference to the states when selling heavy oil. The Venezuelan authorities need to fulfill these requirements before Washington allows them to produce more oil. And so, according to one of National Broadcasting Company news sources, United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated at a closed briefing with members of Congress on January 5 that Washington can force Venezuela to take all these steps because its oil tankers are overflowing. Rubio noted that, according to estimates, Caracas has literally a couple of weeks left before it becomes a financially insolvent state without selling its oil reserves. And then Trump also says, listen, we've agreed that the interim authorities of Venezuela will transfer up to 50 million barrels of oil to the Americans. Trump says, we'll sell them under my leadership, collect the money from this sale, and use that money to rebuild Venezuela. Before that, let me remind you, sources told Politico that the Trump administration demanded that the interim president of Venezuela stop drug trafficking, expel Iranian, Cuban, Russian, and other agents hostile to Washington from the country, and also stop selling oil to the opponents of the United States. In addition, American officials expect that Rodriguez will help facilitate free elections in Venezuela and eventually step down. In addition, recently Trump threatened new tariffs against India if New Delhi does not completely stop buying Russian oil. And today, the largest Indian private oil refiner, Reliance Industries, made a statement, quote, over the past 3 weeks, the Reliance Industries refinery in Jamnagar has not received any shipments of Russian oil and does not expect any crude oil deliveries from Russia in January. So is India shifting away from Russian oil? As a result, according to Bloomberg, the revenue of Russian oil companies continues to decline rapidly following the drop in prices for Urals crude, which is now being sold at almost $1.50 discount compared to Brent. By the end of the week ending January 4, Russia's average 4-week oil export revenue fell to $959 million per week, which is the lowest level since the start of the full-scale war against Ukraine. Compared to the beginning of October, the Russian Federation's oil revenue has decreased by 35% or about $500 million per week. The average price of Urals, the main export grade of Russian oil producers, has dropped by almost 40% since the United States announced sanctions against Rosneft and Lukoil. The collapse in oil revenue promises new problems for the Russian budget, which last year lost every fifth ruble of oil and gas income. And so, for January to November 2025, these oil and gas revenues decreased by almost 2.5 trillion rubles compared to last year, and in December they became the lowest since August 2020. And finally, one more interesting point. In the 2026 budget, the Russian government has planned a slight increase in oil and gas revenues from 8.6 to 8.9. Well, almost 9 trillion rubles, meaning they expect to receive 9 trillion rubles from oil and gas revenues. However, these calculations were based on the expectation that Urals oil would be sold at an average of $56 per barrel, which is $60 higher than current prices. So, even in the best case scenario for Russia, the Kremlin will collect less than half of the projected funds, and this promises very, very big problems. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.